Man, roguelikes are really a dime a dozen these days, aren't they? It seems like every month there's a new semi-high-profile roguelike or roguelite game released where one of the main ideas behind it is to get as far as you can through a randomly generated world or dungeon with randomly generated power-ups, items, and enemies before dying and starting over again, though usually with some sort of resource or foreknowledge that might allow you to make your next attempt a little bit easier. This phenomenon is especially prevalent in the indie space, where games like Nuclear Throne, Enter the Gungeon, The Binding of Isaac, and Rogue Legacy have cropped up throughout the years. And this makes sense. Roguelike games often rely heavily on random generation of a bunch of pre-made assets, which saves the game devs having to draw unique assets for every floor or room, or make a bunch of unique enemies, or even make that many of them, since the game can just rearrange whatever's given to it to make something that's different every time, which often works well with the intended gameplay loop of play, die, upgrade, and then play again. But a lot of roguelikes often fall into a small pool of genres, most often an action game or an action RPG. And don't get me wrong, most of the ones that I've played are still fun, and they all play a little bit differently, at least just enough to not make me confuse them, though honestly Nuclear Throne and Gungeon do come close at times. However, way back in January of this year, a new indie studio known as MegaCrit put out a game on PC that really caught my eye. Yes, it was a roguelike taking place in a vaguely dystopian future or dark fantasy world, with multiple characters to choose from with a layout and path that changes with every playthrough, but it's a card game. Yes, you heard me, Slay the Spire is a card game. We'll get into the mechanics in a moment, but let's start off with the story. Well, there really isn't that much. There's no real cutscene to explain what's going on here, and none of the characters seem interested or capable of giving you any real backstory. But a narrative does start to piece itself together when you start to pick up certain contextual clues. It's a lot like the Soulsborne games in that way, but nowhere near as dense or even as twisted. An indeterminate amount of time ago, a giant spire suddenly appeared on the surface of the world. No one knew what it was, or where it came from, or even what it wanted, but it is alive and quickly proved itself to be malevolent, as it not only unleashed a horde of monsters out into the world, but it seems to be leeching life and energy from the planet itself, slowly reducing it to a hellish wasteland. Many have tried to slay it, but all have failed. And now, with the backing of a mysterious beast, creature, god thing named Niao, who seems to be of the Spire, and yet not, who continuously resurrects 3 specific heroes every time they die, there may just be a way to slay the Spire permanently. The game is structured like this. Every time you start a new game, you pick from 3 characters, each with their own unique cards, strengths, and weaknesses. You start out with a very basic deck consisting of some generic attack and defense cards, as well as a small handful of unique cards. You then travel from the bottom of a simple map to the boss room at the top. Each spot on the map is a unique room that holds a bunch of different things in it. Small horned demon icons are the most plentiful and are just regular enemies for that particular floor of the Spire. Bigger horned demons are elites. They're basically mid-bosses and are a lot trickier to take down if you don't have a good selection of cards. But the rewards that you get for doing so are usually worth it. Treasure chests will generally have, well, just a treasure chest, often containing a special relic or a set of new cards for you to take, but there can sometimes be a chest that is guarded by a monster you'll have to fight for the treasure. Money bags indicate a merchant, where you can spend the gold you earn from battling monsters to buy new cards or remove cards from your deck. He'll also sell you potions and common relics too, if you prefer. And then there are the question marks, which could be any of the above, save for elites, but most often will be special events where you'll be offered a choice, often having to trade something to gain something else, though the game usually gives you the option to just turn around and walk away if you don't like what's being offered. You make your way through each of the rooms to the boss of the floor, earning cards and relics along the way, beat the boss, and then go further down. If you die at any point though, you lose everything. Gold, cards, potions, relics, everything resets to 0. Though you also get a score at the end, which can be put towards earning upgrades for each character separately. These upgrades aren't permanent increases to anything though, rather they give you access to new cards you can find on your journey. And the cards you have access to will be totally dependent on who you choose to start the run with. At the time of my writing this, you have a choice of 3 characters. There's the Ironclad, a powerful warrior who sold his soul to demons in exchange for the power to kill the Spire. The Silent, an assassin who has trained her entire life specifically to try and conquer the Spire's challenges. And the Defect, a security droid that has somehow gained sentience and turned against its master. Depending on your choice, the strategies you can employ are going to be very different. The Ironclad is all about big damage doled out as fast as possible. Unfortunately, while he can cause a lot of damage, he oftentimes sacrifices solid defense or dealing with debuffs or status ailments in favor of just trying to overwhelm his opponents. If you can get his strength up, he is an excellent character to use for beginners. The Silent, by contrast, is all about death by 1,000 cuts. She has a lot of cards that cause little damage but don't cost anything or very little to play, and has a lot of options for increasing her defense or causing status ailments to her enemies, most notably poison and vulnerability. The Defect is a unique beast. He can be equally good at offense or defense, but most of his strategies rely on invoking and channeling orbs that have different effects depending on their elements. So you could, for example, focus on cards that increase his block, while grabbing attack cards that specifically soup up his lightning and darkness orbs, or grab attack cards that allow him to attack directly, while focusing on powering up his frost orbs, which generate armor every turn. When you enter combat, you draw a hand of 5 cards to start, each card costing a certain amount of energy to play, and by default you only start with 3 energy total. Many cards in the game only cost 1 energy, but that does limit you to 3 cards a turn. Your energy refills each turn, but you have to discard any unplayed cards at the end of your turn as well, unless you find a relic that lets you retain your hand. Apart from using attack cards to harm your enemies, you can also use defense cards to add block to your character, which will mitigate any damage you take so long as the block is more than or equal to the damage they're trying to cause. This is pretty important because you retain damage from room to room, and there are not very many ways to heal yourself throughout this game. I mean, yes, there are the bonfires on the map, which do give you the option to heal, but it only ever heals for about 30% of your hit points, and more often than not, you'll want to use the bonfires to smith a card, which lets you upgrade one card once, permanently increasing its power, either increasing its effect, dropping the card cost, or even making the card innate, basically meaning that it will be in your hand at the start of a battle. Defeating monsters not only gets you gold, but also grants you access to new cards which you can add to your deck, and sometimes they'll also drop potions, which are one-time use items that can have any number of effects, such as temporarily raising your stats, giving you a special status such as Thorns or Intangibility, causing damage to your opponent, healing you, or even reviving you if you lose all your hit points. Defeating elites and bosses, or getting lucky with treasure chests and random events, can also get you relics, which will give you a certain permanent boon. Sometimes a one-time bonus, like increased attack or defense for certain cards, increased rewards from battle, more energy for fights, special actions at rest sites, special attacks for playing enough cards, and so forth. However, some of these events and relics can be dangerous too. Many of the relics that increase your maximum energy also require a pretty hefty trade-off, for example, like no longer being able to heal at rest sites, or no longer being able to collect any gold. You can also end up with curse cards through this too, which will stay in your deck and usually do something horrible to you when you draw them, like lowering your energy, or preventing you from playing certain cards. The game loves to challenge you with lots of risk versus reward situations. Yeah, you can turn all of your strike cards into bite cards, which allows you to heal yourself every time you attack an enemy with them, but it'll cost you half of your maximum hit points to do so. And it's those risk versus reward situations that make this game so much fun to play. Despite the game only having 3 floors, plus a hidden 4th floor that you can only access after meeting certain criteria, most of the runs in this game do take a little bit longer than your typical roguelike, usually taking upwards of an hour to even 2 hours to complete one. That's assuming you even get to the end, of course, which can be pretty dicey if you aren't smart about how you construct your deck, as the difficulty spike from one floor to the next is pretty substantial. Most of my average runs come to an end when I end up on the Act 2 boss, especially if it's this asshole here, the Collector. Oh yeah, the bosses for each floor are also randomly chosen from a pool of 3 per act. You could end up fighting this dapper top-hatted slime, but you could also end up facing this annoying Guardian, which switches between high offense and thorny defense modes. To mitigate this, the game does have something that a lot of other, quicker-to-end roguelike games don't include, and that's a save function. You can save any time on the map screen and come back to a run later if you don't have the time or energy to continue it, which I really appreciate for a game like this. Like, I know why saving typically isn't often a thing in this type of game, as it could potentially lead to save scumming and whatnot, but in a game like this that focuses on longer, more thoughtful battles that are just as much about skill as they are luck, yeah, saving is really handy. And yes, luck is a big factor here, as it does affect the fights you have, the cards you find, and the relics you collect, but really the most important thing when playing this game is thinking about the way that you construct your deck. If you're a big fan of TCGs like Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh!, you'll find a lot to like here, as every run through the Spire is taking a very basic deck and outfitting it into something usable. Let's take the Silent as an example, who right now is probably my favorite character to play as. Almost any strategy involving her is going to involve building up her block quite a bit, since she has lower max health than the other 2 characters, but because she relies so heavily on low damage and low cost cards, building your deck around that is important. Her starting relic even allows you to draw 2 extra cards every turn. And the 2 major strategies I like to employ with her is to either build a deck around poisoning my enemies and letting the poison just naturally whittle them down, or get as many cards in my hand as possible and just spam as many shivs at them as possible. Both are more than viable but require proper setup and execution, so by the time you finish the first act, you should really have a good idea of where you want your deck to eventually end up. It requires a lot more careful planning than a much more action-oriented roguelike like Enter the Gungeon or Rogue Legacy. Graphically, the game has an amazing sense of style. It is true that none of the graphics are very animated, most of the characters only having a few frames of animation, and generally only having one pose that they keep throughout most of the game, but the designs more than make up for it. Every character, every monster, and each of the environments around them looks fantastic and unique. You're never going to mistake one thing for another. Everything feels wholly its own. The artwork put on the cards is especially great, making each card very easy to identify just by its look, and they're just fun to look at. The art team even went the extra mile and gave each character unique-looking strike and defense cards, despite those being the exact same from character to character. The sound design also feels pretty damn good. The sound effects are punchy and immediately easy to recognize with each action that's being taken at the moment, and the music, while not overly invasive, really sticks with you. I love how in certain boss and elite battles, there's no music at first, and then it kicks in with a lot of intensity when the battle begins for real. And the game over music, rather than being tragic or sad, feels more uncomfortable and sinister than anything. Even if you don't have an interest in card games, this isn't the sort of game where you try to collect all the cards and then have them all whenever you need them. It's a game that challenges you the same way that many other roguelikes do, taking whatever you're given and trying your best to use them to pull victory from the jaws of defeat. but with the added wrinkle of asking you to strategize and think ahead, rather than immediately react to each new situation as it happens. The only downside I can give is that it does fall victim to a lot of the same problems that other roguelikes do, in that whether or not you have a good run is largely based on luck. But even with a bad run, when it comes to the cards and relics you get, you can still get a decent distance into the Spire. Even on my absolute worst runs, after I figured out how the game worked after my first couple of tries, I don't think I've ever died on the first act, able to make most card combinations work for me. I actually don't think it's fair to lump this in with other roguelikes I brought up earlier in this review, mostly because it is just, well, it stands on its own. Roguelikes, for a while, have been dominated by games that require quick reflexes and good timing and precision, where this is more of a game of thought and strategy. It doesn't mean that either one is bad, but they really do feel like they're both made for different audiences, despite both ostensibly falling under the roguelike moniker. If you're at all interested in the game, it is available on Steam, PS4, and Switch for about $25 on all platforms. The price may be a bit of a sticking point for some, but I can assure you, you'll get your money's worth if you have any love of roguelikes or card games, as the game constantly urges you to try and get further. And if you actually want to see the fourth act of the game and get the individual character endings, well, you'll definitely have your work cut out for you then, let me tell you that. It goes on sale on Steam all the time, which is how I recommend you buy it. I personally prefer most of my games on console, but this game just feels better to play with a mouse and keyboard, just with the way that it's set up. Go ahead and grab it, and you too can feel the joy of getting your shit wrecked by the collector too. You son of a bitch!